Okay, why don't we get going? Thank you for coming to the SACOG Planners Committee. Periodically we put out workshops that are purely just educational. This was the idea of doing a CEQA workshop was something that we had polled our planning committee members on what topics they would like. So our panelists put together a specific topic on CEQA. Just a couple of logistics. If you need the restrooms, go back towards the receptionist and then to the right. Also, after this event, we will post something online about some follow-up information, and Kirk can describe more of what that is. If you guys have additional ideas for other topics in 2014, particularly ones that can get you AICP credits, please let us know, either Casey or myself. We're trying to put together the schedule for this upcoming year. Tentatively, we've got a workshop scheduled on January 23rd, which is a Thursday. It'll be at 10 o'clock on grant writing. There's a lot of grants that are coming up for jurisdictions to apply for, and we're going to have some grants, some grant experts come in and talk about some different strategies. The notice for that won't go out until the first of the year, but just put that on your calendar. I'm going to turn over this event to Kirk Trost. He's the legal counsel for SACOG. And one other thing is be sure, for those of you that need AICP credits, be sure to fill out the yellow surveys and turn them in at the end, because that's what gets you the credit. So with that, Kirk Trost.
Good afternoon. So I'm very curious as to kind of what the level of knowledge or engagement is in the room. So can I just ask, how many people have some knowledge of the statutes that we're talking about today? SB 375, SB 226, SB 743? Do you consider that working knowledge? Couple of hands. Has anyone ever used those statutes and the streamlining in them? A little bit. Who was involved in writing any of those statutes? No. Who's here solely to get AICP credit? Now, including some of our panelists. I love that. So look, my job's easy here today, because the hardest part of my job was getting three really good people here to talk about using these streamlining provisions, and I'm really happy with the panel we got here today. So let me first introduce them, and then I want to just say a few remarks to get us started, or to provide some kind of foundation for what we're going to talk about today. The first person we have is Katherine Hess. It says here she's an AICP. She received her Master's in Administration from UC Davis, following her BA in Political Science from UC Berkeley. She's worked at the City of Davis for over 20 years, and by the way, Katherine and I are the Davis representatives here today, and we've decided that no one is allowed to make fun of Davis except us. So keep your remarks to yourself.
But we will.
We will. She's worked in planning, economic development, and administrative functions, including 4 years as Director of Community Development. She's currently Community Development Administrator for the City of Davis, working with the city's CEQA compliance, key entitlement applications, and a range of public policy issues. And what it doesn't say here is that she loves to ride her bike and that she has a very special relationship with SACOG. Katherine and I work very closely together on a project she's going to talk about today, the Cannery Project, which is a really great, top-notch, gold level type mixed-use development in Davis. And Davis is very proud of it and should be, but her relationship with SACOG goes much deeper than that, because she's forming a very special relationship with a handful of SACOGians who have opened a tasting room and a brewery in West Sacramento. So,
3 times last weekend.
I outed you, yeah. Also here today is Chris Calfee. Chris is Senior Counsel at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. He previously served as Special Counsel to both the Office of Planning and Research and the California Natural Resources Agency, where he was the lead attorney responsible for development and adoption of amendments to the CEQA guidelines and addressing greenhouse gas emissions. That's what his bio says. What you really need to know about Chris is a really thoughtful and intelligent voice in the whole area of CEQA modernization and reform. He's been a very calm and inspirational voice in meetings with people talking about policy issues under CEQA, and he's been really influential, and we at SACOG are very appreciative of the fact that he has brought us into those discussions, that we've been able to talk through some of the very important planning issues, particularly with the last session. As some of you may know, the dialogue about what was going to happen last session started a year ago. It started months before the session even started, when the pro tem and Senator Rubio called people into a room in the Capitol, and we started talking about what people's expectations and aspirations were for CEQA modernization. That all changed. I want to talk about that a little bit later today, but Chris was involved in that, and he's been a great partner to SACOG and a great voice in the CEQA modernization reform movement. So I appreciate that. And finally, Heidi Tschudin. She has over 30 years experience as a land use planner, project manager, and California CEQA specialist. She's experienced in all aspects of land use planning and environmental impact analysis, and has served as planning director for many Northern California jurisdictions. For over 20 years, Heidi has been a principal in her own firm, Tschudin Consulting Group, providing contract planning services to communities throughout California. And the most important thing you need to know about Heidi is that Heidi was the project manager for the EIR that we prepared relating to our Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategy, the first of its kind adopted in the California region, or in the Sacramento region. And Heidi was the cheerleader, was the inspiration. She brought us all these easy buttons as she helped 15 or 20 SACOGians write the EIR for our MTP SCS. Many of whom had never written an EIR in their life, and Heidi gave us writing classes, and she looked over our shoulders, and she helped us through that, and she was really an inspiration and a great team player to work with. So I can't say enough about Heidi, and I'm really glad that she's here today. So, with those introductions, so here's what we're going to talk about today. I want to talk a little bit about the background to CEQA as it existed in 2008, about the time that SB 375 was adopted and signed by Governor Schwarzenegger. I want to talk just very briefly about the three statutes, and then I'm going to leave it up to the panelists to talk about some case studies, practical applications, and lessons learned from trying to apply these new CEQA streamlining tools. And then finally, if we have a minute before we take questions, I want to talk a little bit about the legislative outlook for further CEQA reform or modernization. I do want to let you know that, as Greg said, we'll push out some materials to you after today. We have a website that has a bunch of information that you might find very helpful. The Office of Planning and Research, Chris's office, has some interesting and helpful materials both on SB 226 as well as some very interesting and confusing and complicated flowcharts relating to 375, but they will help you. And that's one of our goals here today, to help you, to give you enough information so that you can start seeing how these tools might apply to the individual projects that come before you, if you're planners or if you're lawyers, helpful in trying to assist your clients. However you might start to use these tools so that we can see if they're all the right tools that we need. I suspect we already know the answer to that, but we need practitioners out in the field to try and use these tools so we can figure out what comes next. So let me talk for just a minute about the landscape in 2008 prior to the adoption of SB 375. And I guess I want to start by talking about SACOG's involvement in all of this. In 2004, SACOG had adopted the blueprint. Is everyone familiar with the blueprint? That, by the way, on the left is the base case scenario, what we expected to happen in the region if we continued on the path as usual, and on the right side is the blueprint map. Well, the blueprint was actually a key taproot for SACOG's involvement in CEQA modernization and streamlining. Our board realized that they were doing something innovative, but it was voluntary, right? There's no requirement that any jurisdiction follow the blueprint. But our board said, what can we do to incentivize people to, in fact, follow the blueprint, to start moving towards smarter growth, to utilize our existing investments in infrastructure? what could we do to leverage that to take advantage of the great thing that we were doing in the Sacramento region? And CEQA streamlining became an important part of that dialogue. But it wasn't, by the way, just about infill and smart growth and transit-oriented development. At least it wasn't to the exclusion of greenfield development, because the blueprint depends upon both of those things. The blueprint is fundamentally about diversity, it's about housing choice, it's about transit choice. And so the plan, the blueprint itself, and even the plan that we adopted in 2012 includes a whole lot of greenfield development. We assume that there's still going to be a need for some, that for us to work as an effective smart region, there's going to be all kinds of development that occurs throughout the region. And so when we started getting involved in CEQA streamlining or modernization, our board gave us the direction to not just think about infill and transit-oriented development and development in urban areas, but to also think about CEQA streamlining for greenfield or developing communities as well. And the result is that SB 375, in fact, included some very smart provisions that are applicable without respect to geographic preference within the region, and we'll talk about those. Having said that, for over a decade, people have been talking about the challenge and difficulties of infill development. And certainly that does have to be a priority when we talk about CEQA reform. There were very few things that people could agree upon when we were meeting across the Capitol over a year ago, but that was one of them, I think, that everyone knew that we weren't doing enough to create an easy enough path for important development projects within our urbanized areas. Why is that? You probably know. There was a study recently done by the San Francisco Urban Land Institute. Has been a lot of really good research done by the Office of Planning and Research over the last couple of years. The problems of building infrastructure in urbanized and infill areas are tough. The financing models are much more difficult in that area. And as I heard Chris Calfee say, cows don't sue. People within urban areas sue over things like noise and aesthetic and historic and cultural resources. Cows don't tend to do that. So I want to spend just a moment talking about the other streamlining that is available under CEQA and has existed at the time that SB 375 was adopted. Let me talk just about the first two. These are all things that someone might use to create an easier path through CEQA compliance. The first two on the list are pretty important, right? Statutory exemption for infill residential projects, but that's limited. Why is it limited? It only applies to residential. There's a pretty long list of stringent requirements that you have to comply with. And most importantly, even if you comply with those requirements, there are still several important exceptions to the exemption. For most CEQA exemptions, if you meet the criteria, you get the exemption. You don't have to do anything under CEQA. For the infill exemption, you do. You have to also establish that there are no project-specific significant effects of the project. You have to establish that there are no changed circumstances that would alter the analysis of the project in a prior environmental document. And you have to establish that there's no new information that affects the prior environmental document that was done for that project area. Really important issues that complicate the utility of an exemption. The categorical exemption is similar in the sense that it's broader, that it covers more than just residential projects, but it's similar in the sense that there are a whole bunch of exceptions to it. Things like, are there hazardous wastes? Is the property listed on a hazardous waste site list? Are there scenic resources related to the property? Are there historic resources? And for all those things under the categorical exemption, those are subject to the fair argument test, right? A much easier legal standard to meet. If you can make any fair argument that one of the exceptions to the exemption would apply, you can't take advantage of the exemption. There are issues with all of these streamlining opportunities for infill. The timing, most of them rely upon a prior environmental document, but most of those environmental documents only have a limited life under these various provisions. There's always a question about whether the infill project precisely fits within the prior description of that project in a prior environmental document. Anyway, a whole lot of barriers. So within that context, SB 375 is adopted, and it provides for 3 potential streamlining opportunities. Mixed-use residential projects. This applies without geographic reference. It can be a project in any geographic setting. It doesn't have to be an infill setting. It is limited to residential projects. 75% of the building square footage has to be residential. It has to be consistent with our sustainable community strategy. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but one of the things that we'll provide to you is a checklist that helps you make a determination about whether a project is consistent with SACOG's SCS. And also, if it's a transit priority project that we'll talk about in a minute, it also would qualify for this CEQA streamlining. So what are the benefits? You don't have to look at the growth-inducing impacts of the project. You don't have to look at the impacts of cars and light trucks on global warming or on the regional transportation network. And finally, you don't have to look at reduced density alternatives. The second path under SB 375 is for transit priority projects. These are residential use projects. In this case, it has to be 50% residential, or if it's between 26 and 50% residential, looking at building square footage, then you have to have an FAR of 0.75 or higher. Minimum density is 20 dwelling units per acre. You have to have proximity to transit. 1/2 mile from a major transit stop, which includes a light rail station, a train station, a ferry terminal, or an intersection of 2 high-quality bus lines, or 1/2 mile proximity to a high-quality transportation corridor, which includes a bus line on which there is 15-minute service during peak periods. And finally, you have to have SCS consistency again. Streamlining benefits. Again, the same things we talked about for mixed-use residential projects. No growth-inducing impacts, no impacts on GHG or global warming or the transportation network. You don't have to look at a reduced density alternative. You have the opportunity to adopt a sustainable communities environmental assessment. This is what Heidi's going to talk about. It's really in the nature of an alternative to a mitigated neg deck. But the important provision in SB 375 is that there's a different legal standard that applies to it. If you were to adopt a mitigated neg deck under the existing law, it's subject to a fair argument standard. A sustainable communities environmental assessment is subject to the substantial evidence test, a much different standard that means a lot when you're trying to litigate an environmental document. Finally, cumulative impacts. If they were assessed in a prior environmental document, you're allowed to make a finding that they've been covered by that prior environmental document, and you don't have to relook at them. You don't have to look at offsite alternatives, and we've talked about the standard of review. Then there's an exemption. By the way, I showed my slides to our communications people. Here's what they told me. There's too much information on that slide. What you need to do is you need to read the statute. This is like the exemption for infill that already exists under the statute. There are a whole bunch of statutory requirements. It's a long list of things. It's a very small list of projects that are going to get the benefit of a full exemption under CEQA. But it exists under the law. It might have some applicability for small projects, small sites, small number of units that meet all of the requirements in the statute. You know, it's not on the Cortese list. There's an affordable housing component attached to it. No riparian, no wetlands impact, no species, protected species or anything like that. So, 226. So where SB 375 focused on mixed-use and residential projects in transit priority areas and mixed-use projects in any geography that was consistent with our sustainable community strategy, 226 really focuses on infill. We're talking about properties that have already been previously developed, that are being redeveloped, or we're talking about properties that are surrounded 75% by other qualified urbanized uses, most in whether it's industrial, commercial, whatever. Chris is going to talk about it. It has a broader application, so not just residential. Any type of use are basically available for this kind of streamlining, 226. But for each one of the land use types, it has to meet a particular performance standard, and Chris is going to talk about those. And finally, it has to be consistent with the SCS. So what streamlining is available? If the impacts were previously analyzed in a planning level document, that is an environmental document for a general plan or a specific plan or a community plan, you do not have to look at that or reanalyze that impact. Even if that impact was not reduced to a less than significant level. So if there's a prior environmental document on a specific plan and there was an override decision, you don't have to analyze it, even though the impact was not overridden. You also are allowed to rely upon uniformly applicable development standards. A local jurisdiction can adopt such standards intended to address impacts, whether it's aesthetic or cultural or traffic. And if those standards address an impact in that infill area, you're allowed to rely upon it. You simply have to make a finding that those standards are intended to and do mitigate for the impact that you're analyzing. Again, it doesn't matter whether the prior level EIR analyzed that impact or not. You can still rely upon applicable development policies. Once you do that, it allows you to, in a future environmental document, not have to analyze that. So under 226, you could get everything from an exemption, in a sense, because you don't have to analyze anything. If every single impact was analyzed in the prior EIR, you would have to do nothing. Or you might have to do an EIR on that infill project. But 226 does have an infill EIR provision, which streamlines somewhat what you have to analyze in that new EIR. Maybe, Chris, you can talk about that a little bit, right? Standard review. Again, 226, you get a substantial evidence standard as opposed to a fair argument standard. So here's just a quick look at a matrix that shows you where these provisions apply, focusing on the Sustainable Communities Environmental Assessment under SB 375 and the 226 infill streamline. And again, as you'll note, 226 has broader application. 375 really focused on residential and mixed-use projects close to transit. That was the focus of that provision, to get regions to do planning that for the first time looked at the relationship between transportation and land use, and then tried to find a way to incentivize what is some of the most difficult things, which is getting residential and mixed-use development near transit, right? Creating the demand for that transit. So 743. So as I said, I'll try and do this very quickly. Over a year ago, there was a lot of aspiration about doing something, a major modernization of CEQA. And in the 11th hour, there was a flurry of legislative activity. And it's really a demonstration that politics is the art of the possible. And the pro tem, Senator Steinberg, realized that SB 731, a bill that he had been working for a year, was not going to be signed by the governor. And so in a last minute move, in the waning hours of the Senate, really, within hours of them adjourning for the year, they adopted 743. And interestingly enough, it turned out to be a pretty momentous bill in terms of potential impacts that are helpful for the implementation of our SCS and the promotion of infill development. How? Well, it creates environmental leadership projects. So if any of you have arenas, it's going to have some meaning to you. So that doesn't have application to anything, unless you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar project. That was designed for the arena. But there are some other important provisions. Parking and aesthetics for residential, mixed-use, and commercial projects within transit priority areas, and by the way, I'll just flag, it's a different definition than was in 375. But essentially, it's for projects that have some close relationship within a half mile of major transit stops. You no longer have to look at parking and aesthetic impacts. It doesn't mean that your jurisdiction, if you're a local planner, can't adopt your own standards and apply them to projects, but you're not required to under CEQA. Specific plans, there's a provision in the government code that allows you to rely upon an EIR for a specific plan. But that provision only relates to residential projects. The provision in 743 expands that beyond just residential projects. And finally, what some of us happen to think is the most important change in that bill is the opportunity to eliminate traffic level of service. Level of service has been the metric that we've used for transportation analysis in California for a long time, and it's resulted in some bad planning decisions from a lot of people's perspective. And so particularly in transit priority areas, in dense urbanized areas around transit, 743 says, OPR, you should adopt new CEQA guidelines for transportation impacts. And once they do that, no one is allowed to use it as a threshold of significance in environmental documents. Again, you can still adopt local policies and standards, but CEQA doesn't require you to do that. And OPR also has the discretion to decide that they're going to look more broadly beyond just transit priority areas, to look at any development in any geography. And if they determine that there's a better metric than level of service, they can include it in the guidelines and it will become a substitute for level of service, and you will not be able to use level of service as a threshold of significance. So, Heidi is going to talk now about sustainable communities environmental assessments and her work to develop those.
Thank you. Hello. As Kirk said, I'm going to focus on SB 375 and in particular using a sustainable communities environmental assessment to accomplish streamlining. I worked with SACOG to actually develop several test SCEAs. The one that I'm going to talk about today, although just sort of reference it, is the Tower Bridge Gateway Remnant Parcel, which is a project in West Sacramento that I'll describe in a moment. But what came out of this effort to test the SCEA was we were able to take the materials that we developed and turn them into templates that could be used for other projects. So there's an SCS Consistency Checklist, which is on the SACOG website. There was also an SCEA initial study that we developed, an SCEA declaration page, and then some good procedural guides. I think that all of those are on the SACOG website, but if they're not on the SACOG website and you contact me, I can get you my materials. So I'll make that promise to you. First, a little bit about this project. It's actually, we'll go backwards. It's a former right-of-way of about 1.65 acres. It's in West Sacramento. There we go. That's the right-of-way right there at the bottom of that property. It's a former segment of West Capitol Avenue. So, again, this is Cross River in West Sac. That's 3rd Street, I believe. That's 5th Street. There's Rayleigh Field right there. And this is the Tower Bridge Gateway roadway. So that's the old right-of-way right there, West Capitol Avenue. And this remnant right here, between 3rd and 5th, as you can see, is immediately south of this property right here. And that, that property is the subject of a mixed-use project that would have about 120 units in a 4-story building. And the idea was, or the proposal was, that this segment of right-of-way would be vacated. The boundaries of the property would be established. It would be conveyed to the tower project developer, and they would then have the opportunity to merge that parcel into the other to create more room for that project. We went through the steps to determine if we could use this project as an SCEA example, and the short answer is yes. And I'm just going to walk through with you what we did to get there. So first of all, we had to answer the question whether or not the project is a qualified transit priority project. And the section of the Public Resources Code that's relevant here is 21155B. And there's some steps that we went through. First of all, we had to figure out whether or not the project contained at least 50% residential use based on total building square footage. Now that metric is a little unusual, I think, for most of us planners to use for a residential project. So sometimes using these tools, especially for the first time, you've got to come up with different protocols and kind of think about how you want to interpret things and relate them to what's going on in your jurisdiction. One of the tricky things for me as a planner in doing this one is you don't always know what the square footage is of the individual residential units at the very front end of a project when you might be doing this. So you have to kind of work with these terms and figure out how to use them in your jurisdiction. The second one is if the project contains between 26 and 50% non-residential, then you have to have a minimum floor area ratio. Now you can define floor area ratio. In fact, probably most of you have it already defined in your zoning code. So again, you're going to be working with your local definition of that. The project has to provide a minimum net density of 20 dwelling units per acre. Net density is defined differently, probably in all of your jurisdictions. There may be some consistency, but not always. So I think the message here that we realized as we were working through these examples is it really needs to be jurisdictional specific. The project must be located within a transit priority area that's studied within the SACOG MTP SCS. Now that's SACOG language, but basically you're all within the SACOG region. So if you're within those transit priority areas as they're defined in that document, then you'll be able to qualify as either a major transit stop or a high quality transit corridor. No more than 25% of the project area can be farther than a half mile from the stop or corridor, and no more than 10% or 100 of the residential units, whichever one of those is less, can be further than a half mile from the stop or corridor. So this is a little measurement scenario you have to go through to figure out if it all falls within the appropriate proximity. All this stuff is pretty easy to do. You don't want to get hung up on the terms, but you do want to think about some of them. So then the next piece of the puzzle was whether or not the project is SCS consistent. And for that, you're going to be looking at Public Resources Code 21155A. So the first step is you have to be within a region that has an MTP SCS that has been accepted by ARB as achieving the greenhouse gas reduction targets. And SACOG's MTP SCS has done that, so you can check off that box. And then you have these whole series of questions related to consistency with the SCS. Now, SACOG has really made that easy by providing an interpretation, essentially, that any project that's consistent with the MTP SCS growth forecasts and the growth forecast assumptions is by definition consistent with the policies. And then for the rest of the questions, you can use the checklist that SACOG has on their website, and it's actually a really easy checklist to use, and I encourage you to actually do it at the front end when you're working with an applicant on a project to even see if you want to go down this path or if you can go down this path. So you'll be able to address land use designation, density, building intensity, all as a part of using the checklist. So if you make
Heidi,
it, yes,
Can I just mention?
Please.
Back to that slide?
I will.
I just want to, because this is kind of a scary phrase here, consistent with SCS applicable policies. It's one of the things that I know it came up in the Cannery project, and it might come up and you might say, oh my God, we have to look at this 300-page document and incorporate all the policies into our EIR for the specific project you're working on. Our assumption is that the applicable policies are really embedded in our land use plan. So for the most part, if your project is consistent with our land use map, you've adopted the applicable policies, okay? That's not a scary thing. You can work through that easily enough if you just follow the checklist. Okay.
I'm going the wrong way, sorry. There we go. Next step. You made it that far, can your project use the SCEA? We're going to have to do a little bit of sleuthing. So the first thing you have to figure out is you have to identify any prior applicable EIRs and even think about what that means. In the Tower Gateway case, there was potentially 4 EIRs that were applicable. And if you think about this may be the same situation that many of you are in. In this case, there was an older general plan EIR. I think it was 1990 vintage. There was an older specific plan EIR, not an unusual situation in my experience. That one was 96 vintage. There was actually a project EIR on a larger project in the area that had included this property. That was even more recent. It was 2006 vintage. Then there was the MTP SCS EIR, which was 2012 vintage. You know at a minimum you're going to be using the MTP SCS EIR because that's part of the analysis. You may have this situation where you have a general plan EIR and a specific plan EIR. We were able to make the conclusion that the way this jurisdiction did their planning, the specific plan EIR was more relevant than the general plan EIR and in effect superseded it. My word, not a legal word. But the idea was you didn't have to use, we didn't feel that we needed to use the general plan EIR because the information in the specific plan EIR covered all the same topics and was a fresher EIR. So we ended up doing the comparison using 3 EIRs. This sounds daunting, but actually if you think about it, if you're doing a negative declaration, you should be doing that same analysis anyway, right? To determine what, if any, prior mitigation measures have been put into place by your jurisdiction that might be applicable to the property. So you have to do it a little more deliberately as a part of this process, and maybe that's not such a bad thing. How you format the initial study is kind of tricky because it ends up being 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional. How are you going to prepare? How are you going to summarize that information in a way that you don't lose the reader or yourself if you're preparing it, and then keep track of it in a way that it becomes the evidence you need to support the conclusions and findings that you're going to make later on. I think the template that is on the SACOG website actually shows a format, yes, Casey's nodding, actually shows the format that we use to have multiple EIRs that you had to analyze, so you might want to take a look at that if you get to that point. It's not as hard as you think, but it's tedious. You just have to walk through it all. You do run the potential, though, when you're comparing EIRs from different time frames and different authors and different political cultures in your jurisdiction, that the way you treat the analysis may be different. It may be more conservative or less conservative. And even the conclusions are sometimes different or reflect different regulatory ordinances that maybe weren't in place when the first conclusions were written, right? The general plan stuff that's older, but maybe are in place later on down the road. So you just have to work through all those, and I think that the message here is to try to make reasonable conclusions about the mitigation measures, and if you're having to compare them, which ones still apply and why, and if they don't apply, why, and explain that in your document. So in that sense, the initial study is really no different from what you're used to preparing all these years for other CEQA documents, which is to document the steps you went through and the logic you went through to reach your conclusions. You do have to dig up the findings of fact for each of those EIRs. That was a little twist that I wasn't anticipating at the beginning. You can't just go to that final EIR and work off of those conclusions. Now, why would that matter? Well, I think in practice, Most of the time, it probably doesn't matter, but in a lot of jurisdictions, the actual wording of the mitigation measure and whether or not some are adopted or rejected doesn't occur in the EIR, it occurs in the findings. And so to make sure that you're working off that latest, greatest adopted information, the law specifically references that you need to use the findings of fact. What's tough about that from a practical point of view is most of your jurisdictions have your active EIRs online. I'll bet you not one of you has your active findings of fact online. So it just creates a hurdle that you need to deal with and something to think about as you're moving forward and as you want to clear the path for more people to use this mechanism to streamline. Did you want to say something on that? Okay. You're going to want to identify feasible mitigation measures, performance standards, and criteria. So this is that process of going through and deciding which of the mitigation measures that are already in the 1, 2, or 3 prior applicable documents that still apply and identifying those and somehow keeping track of them. In the Tower document, what we ended up doing was we just used a little set of initials and coding to kind of refer to each document and the numbering of the mitigation measures, and then we included them all in one appendix in the back so that the initial study itself didn't get huge and you didn't lose track of where you were in the document. And of course, the last thing to be able to use the SCEA is to be able to incorporate those into the project. So that has to be part of the project as you're moving forward, that those mitigation measures will somehow be in there, either as part of the project definition itself or as part of the plans or descriptions of the document. Yes?
But we also believe that you can make a determination that a particular measure is inapplicable to the type of project under consideration. So just because it was in the mitigation measures in the prior environmental document or findings, it doesn't mean it has to be applicable to the project under consideration.
Great point, thank you. So if you've made it that far, then you're actually preparing the SCEA. The Public Resources Code that's relevant here is 21155.2b. So it is basically an initial study. The one that we ended up using as we were working through the SACOG test cases, we actually modified the initial study a little bit. We played around with the instructions section because the columns of the initial study, the way the columns are set up and the way they're titled don't exactly line up with the thinking or theory behind an SCEA. So playing with that a little bit might be something you actually want to do and then adopt that as one of the documents that you use in your jurisdiction. But again, I urge you to look at the SACOG template. You do have to prepare a discussion of cumulative effects and reach this conclusion that they were adequately addressed and mitigated. You can do that as part of question 18B, which is one of those questions in the back of the initial study where it asks you under mandatory findings about cumulative impacts. Excuse me. You have to mitigate to a level of insignificance. I got kind of worked up about this word because I'm used to saying less than significant, and to me those are two different things. But we decided that they were the same thing as intended by the law, so don't get hung up there. But there could be a couple twists here if you think about it. And again, this gets back to what I call the EIR culture of the jurisdiction. You may have a prior EIR, for example, this wouldn't be unusual at all, with significant and unavoidable cumulative impacts. To use the SCEA, you have to be able to show at the project level that you've fully mitigated. So the fact that there's significant and unavoidable cumulative isn't a kill card, but you have to be able to show that for the project you've fully mitigated. The second thing is, you may have an EIR with prior significant and unavoidable project level impacts. That makes the ability to reach that conclusion a little bit trickier, so you just need to look at it and think about it as you're going through the process. The SCEA initial study requires a 30-day circulation period, and you have to consider the comments that you get, so that feels very neg deck-like if you're used to doing neg decks. You do have to hold a hearing, you have to adopt the SCEA, you have to approve the project, and you have to make some findings that are identified in the section that I referenced there in the slide. Just a little FYI, the appeal fees are capped in this legislation, so you need to check your local jurisdiction appeal fees. Most of the places where I work, you guys have pretty low appeal fees because the idea is to let people get into the process if they have a problem. But if your appeal fee is greater than that, you'll have to lower it for this type of procedure. And then that brass ring that Kirk was talking about is the substantial evidence legal standard that is applicable to the document once you get to the end of the road. A few more things related to the SCEA that you don't want to lose track of. As Kirk mentioned, you are not required to discuss impacts to greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with cars or light-duty truck trips. You're also not required to address impacts on the regional transportation network from those same trips. And finally, you're not required to discuss growth-inducing impacts. So growth-inducing comes up in the population and housing series of questions. You won't have to address that one. Conclusions. That SCEA is really a great new tool, a great new opportunity, but it's complicated and it's going to feel a little bit unnerving at first, like any new CEQA document, because you feel exposed. But those templates will help, and it's worth trying to use this because I think this really can become something that your applicants in your jurisdiction will find helpful. You have the free pass that we mentioned for growth inducement, greenhouse gas emissions, and regional transportation system impacts. That's good stuff. And you have that favorable legal standard. And that concludes my remarks.
Any questions of Heidi as we transition to a minute here? Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm going to speak specifically about a case study where we used the streamlining, not the one that Heidi just talked about. We used the SB 375 streamlining for a project consistent with the sustainable community strategy, but not a transit priority project. Greg, how do I make it go forward? The cannery is a 100-acre site. It's within the city of Davis. It's on the north edge of the city. It was the former Hount Wesson cannery, built in 1961, shut down in 1999. That land has been designated for urban uses in the city's general plan. We've got a Measure J, Measure R vote requirement if you change properties from agriculture or open space to an urban use. This is not subject to that because it was already designated for urban uses. The project components on that 100 acres are a lot of uses. We've got 547 residential units. Those range from permanently affordable apartments to single-family detached units, an additional 40 accessory dwelling units, 15-acre mixed-use area at the south next to Covell Boulevard, a green spine with parks and greenbelt, a community farm or urban farm along the eastern edge. The site is on two sides, got agriculture on the north and the east. On the west side, the railroad tracks, the south side, Covell Boulevard. So although it's in the city, we considered it an infill site, there's still some challenges to the property, particularly with regard to access. There were a lot of reasons the city wanted to consider this property. We needed housing for the people who work in town. The mixed-use area provided opportunity for local businesses to grow, and we hope it will give them opportunities to purchase land, which is something that a lot of businesses have been seeking in Davis and haven't been able to accomplish. The residential units will provide students for our schools. Our school-age population has been decreasing, and the residential development will go a long ways to helping us meet our REMA needs. Our housing element's in for review at HCD right now, and these units are a substantial component of that. So the applications, the project currently zoned, well, previously zoned industrial, so it required pretty much every single planning application we have. Environmental review was an EIR, and then we were looking at an affordable housing plan and development agreement. We do process pretty extensively in Davis, so we had 10, if not 11 commissions looking at the project, 3 meetings at the Planning Commission before they made their decision, 3 meetings at the City Council. Final City Council decision was made at the end of November. So as far as the SB 375 streamlining, we used the consistency with the sustainable community strategy approach. This was suggested by Ben Ritchie with De Novo, who was our CEQA consultant, in conjunction with Fair and Peers. Looking at the resources code, It's consistent, we have to have a residential or mixed-use project consistent with the sustainable community strategy and incorporating the mitigation measures. And then, similar to the streamlining that Heidi talked about, we don't have to discuss growth-inducing impacts or the impacts from the cars and the light-duty trucks. So how do we determine SCS consistency? As far as the site was concerned, that was pretty easy. The appendix to the Sustainable Community Strategy explicitly identified this parcel as one that was anticipated for more intense urban development. We worked closely with SACOG. SACOG was phenomenal throughout this whole process and sitting down with us and working through, is it consistent? How do you know it's consistent? How do you know you incorporate the mitigation measures? We had an extensive discussion in the EIR that went through the consistency with the SCS, quoted the SCS, went through the policies in the SCS. Kirk mentioned you didn't have to do that. Maybe you didn't, but we wanted to document that we were consistent with the mixed-use development. We're consistent with the range of housing types. We're consistent with the emphasis on transit and the bicycle connectivity. And we had a checklist in our EIR that went through all the mitigation measures that were in the SCS, identified which ones were applicable to this project. Many of them were not, but showed how the project related to the SCS and the mitigation measures. To my knowledge, that's something that wasn't questioned as we went through the public review process on the project. I'm not aware of anybody who said that it's not.
The EIR is on the city's website. There's a great checklist that Ben and I developed at the end of the greenhouse gas chapter that has a matrix that shows you how you go through and look at every one of the mitigation measures in our EIR and determine whether it was applicable to that project and how it was being dealt with in the project EIR.
One of the things Heidi mentioned that we had to think about a little bit too had to do with whether it's a residential project. For this section of CEQA, you have to be more than 75% of the total building square footage. We had a feel through the EIR of what our non-residential square footage would be, but like most of you, we just used total number of dwelling units, so we had to make some assumptions on the number of dwelling units, the size of the dwelling units, and do the comparison. The EIR concluded that it was about 80% residential. As I was preparing the slides for this, I went back and looked at the revisions. We're now at about 90%. When a project, if it went the other direction, and when you'd catch that and how that would deal with what that would happen is an interesting one that I'll leave to somebody who has a different project other than this one. But some of the assumptions that you make from the beginning of a project, they could change as you go through your review. They probably will. And one lesson learned would be come up with a contingency plan if you think you're getting close, or make sure that you mitigate, or you've got a condition of approval and make sure you're still consistent with your CEQA process. The three things that we talk about, growth inducing was not a major issue with this project. I didn't hear any concerns as we talked to the public. It was pretty much a self-contained site, and so growth inducing impacts were not anything that would have had a significant impact to be addressed anyway. The light impacts on the regional transportation network, that was something that we scoped out. We said we're not going to do this because this project is over a mile from the freeways. We didn't identify when we did our identification of where the trips are going to go. We didn't expect that many trips to go on any individual on-ramp or off-ramp. We did still get some comments from Caltrans. They didn't question the adequacy of the EIR, but Caltrans still noted that we've got regional transportation issues, and this EIR does not analyze those pursuant to CEQA, but that doesn't mean the regional transportation issues go away. And Kirk can talk more about some of the conversations with Caltrans if that comes up. We also did get some community comments as well. And the comments were, we understand the CEQA, we understand the guidelines, but we still should be looking regionally at impacts on the transportation network. And this project might affect those, and part of the disclosure document is CEQA, and part of that could include the regional network. We tried to tie that back to the SCS. I'm not sure in the public how well that worked, but it's something that we did need to work through with our community. And more importantly, the mobile source greenhouse gas emissions, the same thing. We looked at greenhouse gas emissions from the structures, both the residential and the non-residential structures. The city had standards for development of new projects residential-wise, and what your greenhouse gas reduction thresholds were and how to meet those. So we were able to conclude that it met our thresholds, no significant impact on greenhouse gases from the residential or the non-residential. We had to make some assumptions for the mixed use area because we didn't have standards for non-residential uses. But we didn't look at trucks and vehicles. That's 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions in our area. And there were some community concerns about how can you have a complete discussion of the impacts of the project if you're not doing this analysis. The other thing we found that we didn't have those numbers in place, and whether it's because we didn't have the numbers or whether it's because people just wanted to see more on the project, that was tied to some of the comments that we got on a policy basis. Well, you didn't do the greenhouse gas analysis. We need zero net energy for the homes. We need better bicycle connectivity. Because we didn't have numbers, it switched into a policy discussion, and the policies came to, it may meet our standards, but that's still not good enough. We need more sustainability from the project. So as far as the streamlining, it saved us a little bit of cost on the traffic analysis and the impacts of the greenhouse gases. Exciting to me, and I think exciting to the community in general, was this was the opportunity to work with SACOG, and this is the opportunity to say, okay, here's your sustainable community strategy. Here's how it actually applies to a project that is going through a review process, and this is the role of this project in the regional planning. And that was a great thing for us, and I think the consultant liked it, and I really appreciate the opportunity to work with SACOG on that. The community, we still had some questions about disclosure, and remembering that CEQA is a disclosure document, I'm not sure that parts of the community felt that it was completely fair, that we weren't doing a piece of the analysis that they might have liked to see in order to evaluate the whole project. And with greenhouse gases and sustainability in particular, I think part of this analysis took it out of a technical review. When you've got traffic, you've got level of service, you crunch the numbers, you come up with a certain number of minutes of delay, and you put in a certain road widening, or you do a turn pocket or something, and you come to less than significant. And it's a very technical exercise because we didn't have the numbers for greenhouse gases and sustainability in general. We had some goals for the city, we had some policies for the city. There was community discussion about whether meeting our standards was good enough or whether we should establish higher standards for the project. It took it out of a technical exercise and made it more of a policy discussion, which is probably where it belongs. But it did make it a little less precise as we went through the process. And the planning commission, the public, the reviewers, we didn't have a right answer on how sustainable is enough, what the right efforts are for greenhouse gases. And it came down to a policy decision at the end. So
Katherine, let me ask you a question. We talked a little bit about the difference between saying you're taking advantage of a streamlining provision in the statute that says you don't have to look at impacts on the transportation network, as opposed to saying these impacts have already been looked at in a prior environmental document. There's some nomenclature to use there that make it look a lot different to potential members of the community, right?
Absolutely. And I don't know that we could go as far as saying, look, the sustainable community strategy came to this conclusion on the regional transportation network, and therefore this project was assumed and is an integral part, because who's to say whether one project is more critical than another? But you're right, the context of how the determinations from SACOG covered it, mitigated it. We're implementing those decisions that were already cleared through CEQA, perhaps could have been better clarified.
And the only other thing, I don't know if there's anyone from Caltrans who really want to say something in the room, but I will say that engagement early with Caltrans, when you're talking about using these streamlining provisions and you're talking about the regional transportation network, is really key. And I expect Caltrans to be a really active partner as we look towards the adoption of our sustainable community strategy in 2016, so that we make sure that we get out in front of all their concerns about what we're doing to make sure our network is safe.
I just wanted to maybe hear a few more words about the savings on the traffic analysis, because that's really a burdensome thing that costs a lot of money on a lot of projects, very small projects. Now, can you say a little bit more about the order of magnitude and how you pull that off?
How do I make it go?
Push it down. Hold it down.
Ah, got it.
Hold it down.
Hold.
Hold it down.
And keep holding.
Push it, keep holding it down.
Push flex.
There we go. Okay. I can't tell you exactly how much it saved, but we didn't have to do monitoring on the main line. We didn't have to do trip counts. We didn't have to then do the calculations on what those impacts would be. For this particular project, because we had fewer than 5% of the trips going in any direction, I don't think it would have been significant. For other projects, it certainly would be.
Okay, we're going to switch gears just a little bit from SB 375 to SB 226. Has anyone here read SB 226, the legislation? Brave souls. Has anyone looked at the new CEQA guidelines that were adopted to implement SB 226? Just a handful of others. Okay, so I will walk through it in a little bit. Are we able to get back? Either way. This is the first slide. So one thing to keep in mind about SB 226 is it is a reaction to a lot of what we heard about how difficult it is to do CEQA if you're an infill project. As Kirk mentioned, there are lots of difficulties when it comes to doing infill projects in the CEQA context. We also heard a lot from people that the existing streamlining and exemptions for an infill weren't really working, in that they were either really, really complicated. Recall the huge long list of conditions that Kirk brought up with regard to the statutory exemption, or the relief just wasn't very defensible because there were exceptions to the exemption or the fair argument standard applied. So SB 226 was developed as a reaction to all of those criticisms of prior streamlining provisions. It is limited to infill areas. We are talking about infill and not all types of projects, although it is much broader than SB 375. It includes not just residential and mixed use, but also residential, commercial, office buildings, schools, transit stations, and mixed use projects. It's also not tied, like some of the 375 provisions, to proximity to transit. It can be used in a much broader array of the state. So we'll walk through that in a little bit of detail.
But only in cities, right?
Only in cities. That's a very good point, Heidi. Primarily in cities. It can be used in unincorporated areas if they're completely surrounded by other cities. So it does get to the island communities, but for the most part, we're talking about cities here. As Kirk mentioned, the primary relief mechanism here, it's not your classic exemption. It is a streamlining tool. So it allows lead agencies to rely on analysis that's already been done at a planning level. So at a general plan level, specific plan, zoning code, that type of level. Where that analysis has already been done, if that analysis remains valid for your individual project, then you're not repeating that analysis. Or if you have adopted some locally uniformly applicable development policies at the local level, you can rely on those standards instead of doing new analysis for that project. There may be some instances where you're doing some additional review for your project if something hasn't been analyzed before, but then your new review is focused solely on that new impact. You're not doing a huge new EIR for every single project. At least that's the theory. In order to get the benefit of this streamlining, SB 226 says that the project has to satisfy some performance standards. And again, the idea of the performance standards is to provide a little bit more flexibility in project design and project location. The statute directed OPR and Resources Agency to come up with these performance standards. And it said that the performance standards had to satisfy a pretty big laundry list of objectives, environmental objectives, including it had to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce vehicle miles traveled, reduce water use, reduce energy use, had to promote transit and a transit-rich environment, and it had to protect public health. And so you can imagine that given that long list of objectives, OPR and Resources could have come up with something that looked a lot like a lead checklist. Instead, we wanted to go the other way. We wanted to keep it as simple as possible. So as you'll see when we walk through the performance standards, what we're looking for the most part, is that the project locate in an area where people don't have to drive very much. That could mean being next to transit if you have some high quality transit in your area, or if your project, if you're in an area where it's not a transit rich environment, if your project locates in an area where the existing community fabric already allows people to walk or bike or get around by not having to drive very far, then you can also access the streamlining. So let's walk through a couple of the quirks in 226 just to give you a sense of where it may or may not apply. So I mentioned that it is pretty focused on infill. It has to be on an infill parcel in a city. And again, it has to be in an area where you're not driving too much. So either next to transit or within a low vehicle miles traveled area. And we'll talk more about that. There's an infill parcel on the left. On the right is an ag field. You're not going to be developing on the ag field. Transit, Kirk already covered that. It's rail lines, major bus lines, intersections of bus lines, ferries if you happen to have any. By the way, these pictures were all taken in areas where I either live or work. And the point is that we're not talking about streamlining that only applies in Europe. This is stuff that can happen in your community too. So the bus and the light rail there, that's right next to the Resources Agency. A low VMT area, as it's defined in the guidelines, means an area where the traffic analysis zone, where the amount of driving that occurs in that traffic analysis zone is less than the regional average. So it's not statewide average, it's not neighborhood average. You're looking at how does a particular area compare to a region-wide average. So this illustration here, if you look at the green and the yellow areas on that map, those are the areas within the SACOG region where the traffic analysis zone, where driving in that area is less than regional average. If you're less than regional average, you're considered in a low VMT area and you have access to streamlining. If you look at that map, that covers quite a bit of area. It's not just right next to the rail stations or the major bus lines. Okay, consistency with an SCS, we've already talked a good deal about that. That is a requirement for SB 226 as well. So I mentioned that the applicability of 226 goes beyond just residential mixed use. We're going to walk through it at this point in the presentation, the performance standards that apply to each different type of use. So for residential projects, in order to get access to streamlining, your project would need to be either, remember, we're focusing on areas where you don't have to drive so much. So either within a half mile of transit, or in a low VMT area, or be completely affordable, under 300 units. This particular project, it happens to meet all three requirements, but your project would only have to meet one. In addition to the low driving criterion, residential projects would also have to satisfy a couple of other standards. That includes including a renewable component in your project if it's feasible. That's a recommended measure. Recall that the new building code standards, they do require all new residential projects to be solar ready. So this would be a matter of including some solar on your project. If your project would need any cleanup, if it's located on a Cortese list site, for example, go ahead and do that cleanup. If your residential project is located near a high volume roadway or a stationary source of toxic contaminants, then if your community has already adopted some health protective policies, then your project just needs to implement those. If you're in a community that hasn't already adopted those health protective policies, then adopt some measures specific to that project that the lead agency finds protects public health, and you're done. So those are the standards for residential. Pretty similar for commercial. For commercial projects, either locate in a low VMT area or locate close to a customer base. So that is defined in the guidelines to mean within a half mile of 1,800 dwelling units. I should mention that the statute defines commercial to mean it has to be on a site where no more than half of the site is dedicated to parking. So that's essentially a 0.5 FAR, although it's not defined in terms of FAR. Additional performance standards are it should be below a 50,000 foot square foot floor plate. That would exclude the large regional serving big box stores because they generate a lot of trouble. Also for commercial projects, do include a renewable energy component, and again, if there's any cleanup needed on the site, go ahead and do that. For office buildings, again, be close to transit, so within a half mile of rail or a quarter mile of bus, and be in a low BMT area. Add on your renewable energy component, do any cleanup that's necessary. For transit stations, we want you to build them anywhere. There's no location requirements there. Also note that the guidelines define transit station to be something beyond just the station itself, but to include improvements that are necessary to get people to that transit station, like bulb outs and bike lanes and pedestrian improvements, within a quarter mile of the transit station. Again, do your renewable energy component if it's feasible. I highlight the word feasible because if you look at this particular transit station, meaning a bus shelter, it's probably not feasible to add solar onto that thing. But if you're talking about a major multimodal Amtrak station, it might be more feasible to do renewable solar panels there. And again, do your cleanup if it's necessary. For schools, locate within a half mile of transit or close to your student population. So within a mile for elementary schools or 2 miles for high schools, that's within 2 miles of half of your student population. Again, do renewable, add some bike parking, do some cleanup if necessary, and make sure that you're complying with the education code requirements about stationary sources and being located next to high volume roadways. If you're not representing a school district, that may not mean as much to you. Okay, so for mixed use projects, the standards that apply there are the ones that apply to the dominant use. So if it's a primarily residential project, then you would apply to performance standards that apply to residential uses. What else? That's a summary of the main eligibility criteria. You've already looked at those. So once you've determined that your project is potentially eligible, what the guidelines suggest, not require, but suggest, is that the lead agency fill out the Appendix N Infill Checklist. And so what that is you fill out your project description criteria, where it's located, etc. The checklist allows you to demonstrate that, yes, I'm eligible based on the performance criteria. It also takes you through an analysis of have all impacts been analyzed by prior documents. And so this is what that might look like. The Appendix N checklist looks very similar. It looks like Appendix G. It's modeled on Appendix G, but it adds on a couple of questions. And so the first question is, have the effects of my project already been analyzed in some other document? So take this question about would the project substantially degrade the existing visual character? If I'm developing a 10-unit condo building, I might ask, okay, did my general plan, did the EIR for that general plan look at potential aesthetic impacts for this particular area? And a lot of them do. A lot of them will include policies to protect aesthetic values. It might include design review requirements and things like that. If your general plan EIR did look at those aesthetic issues, you would say, okay, check the box for analyzed in the prior EIR. You would note where in that prior EIR that analysis has occurred, and you would move on. Kirk.
So does that potentially create the same problem that Heidi was talking about, multiple EIRs that you're going to have to look at to also scan for those issues?
What's different about 226 is, unlike 375, where you would have to hunt and peck for all of the potentially applicable EIRs, with 226, what you're doing is looking for was this impact analyzed? So if it wasn't analyzed in my general plan EIR, I might want to look at the specific plan EIR to see if that got to it, and if not, the zoning code EIR or something like that, so that you can cobble together a full analysis for your project by looking at the other types.
The only question was it analyzed in some location?
In some locations, so that's why you would just want to indicate where that analysis occurred. But of course, there are some impacts that aren't going to be analyzed at the planning level. So take this question, for example, would the project substantially increase hazards due to a design feature? So how many general plan EIRs do you know that look at driveway design, for example? It's not too likely. But many local jurisdictions do have, again, design review or standard conditions of approval that would get at things like safe driveway design. In that case, you could say, that is my uniformly applicable development policy. You would check the box for it's substantially mitigated by that policy, and you would move on. A key for the uniformly applicable development policies, they don't necessarily have to mitigate it to a less than significant level. Substantially mitigated means that you do something to lessen the effect, but it may be at the end of the day, take construction noise, for example. Building construction is very noisy, and you won't be able to eliminate noise altogether. But if you comply with your construction noise ordinance, that might be enough to at least lessen the impact, and you can move on. So what's happening? Is anyone using this? Has anyone here used the new CEQA Streamlined? No? Okay. Well, that's fair enough, because they only went into effect Valentine's Day of this year. So they've been in place for a couple of months now. It turns out that the city of Berkeley has been able to use it. And so here's a picture of the project that they did approve. It was a 69 dwelling unit residential commercial mixed use project. It was close to the BART station, so it was close to transit. It happened to be included on a Cortese list, so that would have precluded application of the categorical exemption for infill. But they had analyzed the project's impacts in the downtown Berkeley EIR, so they were able to use this project and quickly approve the project without doing additional CEQA review. I've talked to another developer in Berkeley who is planning to use this provision for his new project. We're also seeing some movement on the plan level. So this is an image from the city of Anaheim's housing element update. I don't know if you can see it too well on the screen, but the green areas within the city, those are the low VMT areas. They've identified where the low VMT areas are within the city. And the EIR has done a focused look at specific infill opportunity kind of housing sites. So they've identified with some specificity the types of projects that might go in particular locations. So by doing this type of analysis, they are enabling future development to take advantage of the 226 regs. Now we've done some work with the city of Oroville. It turns out Butte CAG has done a VMT map for Butte, and it turns out that a good deal of the city of Oroville turns out to be a low VMT area. The city of Oroville has also recently adopted and updated their general plan, so we've worked with them to identify the low VMT areas and how that overlays with their new general plan. So I'm illustrating these to show that there's some reason to believe that we might actually get some people using this. I've heard from a couple of folks, though, that, hey, I've read it, I'm not really sure it would work for my project. Has anyone come to that conclusion? They've looked at it, but they haven't been able to use it for their project? One in Davis. I encourage you, even if you haven't done so already, if you have looked through the materials and you think there are some problems, now is a good time to tell me, because we are undergoing an update to the CEQA guidelines as we speak. So if you notice problems in the way that the guidelines are written, now is a good time for us to know about it. But I think that is the end of my presentation. So I'll hand it back to Kirk.
So, get some lights. So any questions for any of the panelists? Yeah.
Mr. Calfee, what would you say to somebody who asked, what's better about using 226 compared to old streamlining techniques, such as those described under 2108.3.3 of the Public Resources Code?
So the question was, how is 226 any better than any other streamlining, including that for 21083.3? You're good to raise that. 226 was modeled on 21083.3, and that's a provision in CEQA already existing for projects that are consistent with the general plan or zoning code. I happen to like that provision, but there are some quirks about using it, and there's some things that have made it difficult for people to apply it. And we hope that we fixed that with 226. So just as one example, take the development policies. There's a similar provision in 21083.3, but it requires that the lead agency, when they adopt those development standards, that they make a finding that they are to be used for that purpose. And almost no jurisdiction has actually made that finding ahead of adopting their construction noise ordinance and others. So 226 eliminates that. There's also the issue of, for 21083.3, a lot of places consider that you can only use that, you can only draw from analysis in a comprehensive general plan update, one document. So 226 allows you to draw from a general plan update, an amendment, a specific plan, zoning code. You can draw from a whole bunch of different sources in order to use it. So there's a table in the narrative explanation on OPR's website of 226, and it attempts to say how 226 is better than others.
Over here.
A lot of jurisdictions are either developing or have developed climate action plans, and it seems that the thinking is once they have this climate action plan in place, that will afford them some streamlining, CEQA streamlining when they are doing certain projects. And would that only be true if their climate action plan demonstrated that it in turn was consistent with not just SB 375 but 8032? That's not addressed to any particular person. If anyone has any comments on that.
Well, Chris, if a jurisdiction adopted a climate action plan, would they be able to utilize that in a subsequent project trying to use SB 226? If that climate action plan was part of a community level planning document and an EIR was done, so it analyzed those impacts, presumably you would be able to rely upon that analysis in applying SB 226 streamlining, correct?
That is correct, as long as it was an EIR that was prepared.
Right. And I think this is a good question though. If it were just done on a community action plan that wasn't incorporated into a specific plan or a general plan, would it still be available? Is that considered a community level planning document?
No.
Okay.
So, but the streamlining for climate action plans, it's under a separate section of the CEQA guidelines. The streamlining that it gets you is just analysis of greenhouse gas emissions. It's not all of the other impacts that might be.
Could I, the city of Sacramento, they have a standalone climate action plan, but they're now rolling it into the general plan. Is that going to help with it?
It seems to be a trend that people are thinking that, I should back up and say climate action plans were kind of a stopgap measure. Right after people realized, hey, we need to pay attention to climate change, a lot of places were a long way away from doing a general plan update, but could relatively quickly develop a climate action plan. So the guidelines were updated to allow people to use those climate action plans. But I think by and large, the best place to deal with these large cumulative programmatic issues is in the context of a general plan update.
Another question? Matt?
I still don't understand what the parameters are of the expansion of benefits, streamlining benefits to commercial in 743. What that looks like, or what the parameters are of it.
You want to take that, or you want me to? Well, under 743, for example, the provision in 743 that says that you do not have to look at aesthetic and parking impacts in transit priority areas applies to commercial projects. The provision relating to traffic level of service, again, OPR is not required to come up with an alternative metric to level of service, but if they do, that would it would kind of occupy the field. Unless they say that it continues to apply somewhere, it will not apply to any kind of projects in any geography.
I understood that actually. I guess I was wondering what is the definition of commercial with 743? Does it apply to anything from an arena to a mom and pop shop, or what? Any commercial project is applicable for streamlining?
Basically, local designation.
So 743, I think it actually uses the term employment center project, and that's defined to mean commercial with a floor area ratio of 0.75. I believe that's right. The other piece
It also has to be infill within a TPA, correct?
Yes, for the parking and
Right.
aesthetics.
Right.
The other bit of streamlining that a commercial project would get is if it's consistent with the specific plan and consistent with the sustainable community strategy, it may qualify for that exemption.
Which previously only applied to residential. Other questions?
I can clarify that the SCS consistency determination is made by the local jurisdiction, it's not by SACOG, but the SACOG is there as a resource to make sure it can help us check the math, but ultimately the decision rests with the locals, correct?
Right, that's a very good question. SB 375 is silent on that. It just requires SCS consistency. In Sacramento, in the SACOG region, our board made a policy decision that decision is up to the local jurisdictions to make on their own. But we're available to answer that question, and we've provided our SCS consistency checklist as a tool to help local jurisdictions make that decision. And if we're asked, we will opine on the subject for jurisdictions. But that's a question that's an issue that's not addressed in the statute. So let me just say two things here. First of all, I want to say thank you to our panel for Second, I want to say that the time is up, so you should feel free to go, but I'm going to stick around. I'm hoping other members of the panel might be willing to stick around to answer any questions you have afterwards. And let me just say one final word about a look ahead. In the new session, legislative session that starts in January, we have the end of the speaker's term as well as the end of the pro tem's term. And given what happened last year, I'm guessing that there's going to be very little appetite to take up the subject of CEQA reform or modernization in this session. I think there's also a desire to see how these new CEQA streamlining tools will work. Don't know for sure, but that's my early look at the session. However, like every other session, you can expect that at the end of the session, someone will have a project that they think should get CEQA streamlining, and there'll probably be some bills that come in as spot bills or something at the end of the session, so we can continue to talk about CEQA streamlining, but I don't expect it to happen in kind of a regular, uniform kind of way, debated throughout the entire legislative session next time. But I think from SACOG's point of view, and I don't know, I won't speak for Chris, we don't think the work is done here. We think there are still lots of opportunities to improve CEQA streamlining. The notion is that with the blueprint and the adoption of sustainable community strategies around the state, that we're making planning level decisions about where projects should be and how we should organize the land use and the transportation for a region. And having made those regional decisions, and recognizing that the project decisions are up to the locals, but having made those regional decisions, our CEQA statute should reflect that policy interest. It should do what it can to incentivize, to make easier pursuing the implementation of those regional plans. So from our perspective, we're going to continue to look for CEQA streamlining where it's smart, where it reflects smart land use decisions and smart growth in the region. So with that, thank you.